Hello, hola, guten tag, bonjour. Yeah, it's me, Seb. Welcome to another little video. I hope you're well. I've been reading lots of great books lately, and also some not so great books, but in both cases I've kind of noticed things that I don't like in the writing. It's interesting because, well, I guess it makes sense. The things that I don't like, I really notice. And I guess it's because if you don't like it, it pushes you away from the story, and if you do like it, it draws you into the story. So it makes sense that the critical stuff is more vivid, I guess, in my mind. But anyway, I thought, I don't like these. I want them to all just disappear from the world, or, well, no, I want some of them to just be like reduced greatly or just disappear from my life. I'm sure other readers enjoy them, and all of them, I think, well, maybe most of them could be used well. They're just not for me. So if you are very passionate about a certain writing technique that I talk about in this video, then I'm sorry, but I probably hate it. So yeah, here is a list of writing techniques that I've noticed recently that I really don't like. Or some of them I knew I didn't like them, but recently they've been, that sense has been solidified, let's say, from my reading. So first of all, this is something that I've mentioned, I think, actually quite a few times on this channel: one-line paragraphs. You know what I mean, right? Like you have a big chunky normal sized paragraph, and then boom, one little line, and then another big normal paragraph. So normally for me it's just really melodramatic and kind of like cheesy, and it depends on the situation, right? Because if I'm reading like a thriller, and it's something where I know exactly the kind of cheap thrill that the book is offering me, and it's like, you know, it's describing a house, and then the one-line paragraph is, she turned around and there was a man behind her. That's great. I love that. I love stuff that just like, it's wearing its cheesy heart on its sleeve, and everything is fine. It's when the book is trying to be like, it's trying to be more. It's trying to sort of like say something really important, or, you know, just like be a little bit more profound or meaningful. I think you usually just don't need that one-line paragraph. There are occasions where they work really well for me. Like I remember in Tokyo Ueno Station, there were some one-line paragraphs which were almost like little haikus. Like the image was startling and vivid and came out of nowhere, but really fit with everything and deserved its own little space. Recently I'm reading this, Slaughterhouse 5. There's a little, Slaughterhouse 5. And this had a one-line paragraph near the beginning, which I absolutely loved. So I discovered, wow, the opposite does exist for me in this case. What was it? It's telling the life about this guy, Billy Pilgrim, and it talks about his experience in the war, and it talks about he gets married, and like it's going through different bits of his life, all like normal sort of like expository paragraphs, and it talks about how he gets into optometry, the business, and then there's like a demand for lenses and frames, which makes him quite wealthy. And then there's this one single line paragraph: frames are where the money is. And I just love that, because it's like, of all the bits of his life which had significance, this was the one that Kurt Vonnegut thought needed its own special space. Frames are where the money is. And it's surprising, and it's interesting as well, because I guess it is significant because it's telling you a detail about how he ends up becoming wealthy, but it's not really important for the plot or anything. So yeah, it's the detail that the writer chooses to give the whole paragraph to in just a single line. I guess that's the point. And almost always I find the detail does not deserve its own space. If it's not, you know, out and proud cheesy, and it's not you know, picking a really clever and exquisite detail that would like never be really noticed otherwise, then get those tiny paragraphs out of here. We don't need them. That's what I say. Next one, number 2. It doesn't have a name as far as I know, but I'm sure it's in loads of things, but I only really noticed it in the Song of Achilles, where it was repeated ad nauseum. So I just call it the Song of Achilles thing now, and I've seen it since in other books, and it just gives me flashbacks. And I liked the Song of Achilles. I gave that 5 stars on Goodreads. But this one writing technique, man, it's like putting a suggestion or a desire or something with potential into a sentence, and then immediately negating that in the next short sentence that follows. So, for example, Patroclus will say something like, I wanted Achilles to look up at me. He did not. I walked into the forest and expected to find the centaur there. He was not there. It's kind of like the one-line paragraph, because like if there was a comma and then the word but in between those two sentences, I would probably be fine with them. It's the fact that they're broken off into this really melodramatic pairing, which just doesn't, I mean, it's okay once in a while, and I know what she was trying to do, right? Madeline Miller, I'm sure she was giving characterization to Patroclus. I mean, I imagine, I haven't read Circe, so maybe this is just her writing style, but I hope it was just supposed to give us a sense of Patroclus as this kind of pessimistic, pensive guy. But yeah, it was way too much. It was way too much. The job should have been easy. It was not. I was hoping the clouds would go away. They did not. I don't know, I found it so annoying. Those little negations do not deserve a whole sentence to themselves. No one thinks like that. At the beginning, right, of the novel, it's all like about characterization, but it kind of gears up and the plot moves towards the Trojan War in the second half. And I was really hoping that as we kind of like abandoned the setup phase and went into the dramatic action phase, then some of those unnecessarily like short sentence things that are just like this weird quirk of Patroclus or Madeline Miller, I don't know. I just really hoped that they would kind of vanish from the novel, but they did not. So number 3, the Song of Achilles also is an offender here. Tense switching. Like, you know, switching between past, present, future. Normally between past and present is the one that happens the most. And, you know, it can, like a few of these things, it can be done really well. And I don't know, like, actually, can it be done really well? I mean, have you ever read something where they switched the tense and it was just like, wow, what a great tense switch? Like, I don't know. Yeah, generally no. Why would you do it? Like in the Madeline Miller one, I remember in the paragraph, you would go, you know, like past, then present, then back to past again. And I wonder why. And if there's some intention behind it, then I don't know. It just feels like the editor missed it. You know what I mean? And then even when it's obvious that there is intention, that's why I call it a writing technique. You know, I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt here, because sometimes it's definitely intentional. So I read Ransom as well in my Greek myth month, alongside the Song of Achilles. And this one was like, had like different parts, like lots of books, you know, part 1, part 2, part 3. And one whole like third, I think, of the book was in different tense from the rest. I forget if it was like past, present, past again, or if it was present, then to past, and you know, whatever. But one section to itself switched. And when it started, I was like, oh, interesting. I wonder why he decided to do that, and I'm still wondering to this day. Numero 4, weird italics. Also underlining things. Like, if you're going to write a book and you think, I need to underline things, you better have a good reason. That's all I'm going to say. Like, this shit's just annoying. It's like, it was in The Gathering because there's a bit where we read a letter written by her dead brother, the narrator's dead brother, Liam, and a bit's underlined. And I read it and I was like, what? And I was like, oh, okay. Yeah, it's a letter, so when you write letters, you don't write in italics because it's handwriting, you underline them. So it actually makes sense. But I just thought, you know, we don't need to be, that detail doesn't add anything. If you put it in italics, it wouldn't break the immersion. It wouldn't make us think, huh? People don't write letters in italics. There's so many times that italics are totally fine. It's not italics and underlining in general that I have a problem with. It's when they're done in ways which make you go, what? And like really break the immersion. So like in Oedipus at Colonus, the version that I read, the original by Sophocles, I imagine didn't have italics, but the version that I read recently, I'll leave a link to that video. I've talked a lot about the Greek stuff here, so I'll leave a link to that video somewhere. But yeah, that had italics in the weirdest places. I don't remember what it did, but I remember thinking, this is hard to read. If the italics are there, they should be in a place which is accepted and like kind of understood by the reading community. I sound like a real like traditionalist here, but when it comes to italics, I honestly think that like, you know, if it's first person thinking, if a character starts thinking in first person, then yeah, it makes sense to put the italics as in the same way we use quotation marks if it was spoken. So like I'm fine with that. And if it's a play, then you know, stage directions and stuff like that, then yeah, sure, go for it. There's a significant exception. There was one time where I read really weird italics that I absolutely loved it. This was in a short story by one of my favorite writers ever, Kanai Mieko. She is amazing. She's a genius. She can do what she likes. She can break all of these rules because she'll always do a good job. So in this short story, I forget what it was about, but I remember like everywhere there were just italicized words and phrases, and at first it's really jarring. You're like, why is this, you know, what's going on? And then as you read it, it starts to just make sense, and not in a sort of like if you string them all together it spells out who the murderer is kind of way. It's not that kind of, she's not that kind of writer. It's kind of, it's hard to explain, but it's just this accumulative effect of what it does to divide the text into these certain words and to pull out certain things and to highlight them, and it's great. No other writer is allowed to do that. Only Kanai Mieko. She's the only one who's allowed to do that because she's able to use weird italics. No one else is able to use weird italics. That's the rules. I've said it. Okay. Number 5, and I thought about how to word this, and I settled on narrators who are writing a fiction. So if the narrator is a fictional character and they're writing about the fictional world that they're in, then that's fine, and that's totally normal, right? It's in so many books where a narrator's like, this happened and I need to tell you about it. Epistolary novels and stuff like that, that's great, love it. I recently read Demons by Dostoevsky, which I talk about a lot now. The writer says he needs to chronicle the things that have happened in his little town. So he's a character as well, but he's trying to put himself out of the spotlight. And I love that you know, the narrator is a writer and it's all in the same fictional world. That's great. Even if the narrator is a writer who is kind of in a different world, but like, I mean, I'm thinking of a very specific example. Like in The Lord of the Rings, it begins with this framing device with a narrator saying he has this book, I think written by hobbits or something, maybe written by Frodo or Bilbo or whatever, and he is going to either translate or adapt it into the English language for us so that we can know some of the history of what happened in Middle-earth, which seems to be the same as our Earth in that framing device. And that's okay because that narrator kind of, you know, eases us into the fantasy world, and then it disappears and it's never heard from again. And when you get to the end, you don't want to go back to that framing device. No, it's just a kind of a way in, and that's cool. I like that. What I don't like, what I really, generally speaking, cannot stand, is a narrator who keeps popping up in the story to remind us that this is all just a fantasy that he's writing. It's all a figment of his imagination or her imagination. Now, fourth wall breaking is okay. I'm okay when they break the fourth wall, generally speaking, like if it's in moderation. Like some books that I love, like the Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, that has a moment, I think like halfway through or something, where Wilde suddenly like turns to the reader almost, like if it was a film, you can imagine he would just face the camera and tells you some of his opinions on stuff, and then he gets back into the story again. And it's done really well, and it's really refreshing, and it doesn't feel like it ruins anything. Like of course it breaks the immersion a bit, but it's kind of like jolts you a bit, and it immerses you then back into the story, and it's all relevant stuff, so it's great. But yeah, when the narrator keeps coming back and keeps kind of reminding you that he or she is just writing the thing that you're reading, then it makes me think, okay, so what is this then? If I'm not immersed in this world anymore because you've just pulled me out of it really violently, am I supposed to think of it like it's a character study of this narrator who I do not care about? I read this in The Hour of the Star by Clarice Lispector. That was a disappointment. I mean, there was some really interesting stuff in there, but the thing that really like kind of ruined this book for me was the obnoxious narrator, who I think was meant to be a bit obnoxious, but who's doing this double thing of telling us the story and then coming in and saying like, how shall I invent it now? What shall I do with this character? And like, it was just neither the narrator's creative process nor the story that we kept getting wrenched out of were like good enough by themselves in that kind of weird dual format. And for me, it was just really jarring. Also, The French Lieutenant's Woman by John Fowles, I remember, really postmodern book. and it's like a Victorian novel, but it's written in like the 60s or 70s or something, and the narrator keeps reminding us that he's writing it in the 60s or 70s. Like he sometimes uses like a metaphor with an airplane or something like that, and obviously again it's intentional, but for me it just kind of kept tearing me away from the story, and I didn't see what it really added to it, because I didn't care about the narrator and what was going on in his life. I guess if the narrator was hypothetically like, you know, established as a character that I was invested in, then this could work. But generally they're not in the kind of writing that I think about. Also, when I started reading Slaughterhouse-Five. Oh, that came off. The first chapter is like that, and I was just, I mean, I didn't know what to expect from this book. I went in blind, and I was like, first of all, it's a war book, and that's also something which is just not usually something I'm attracted to at all. And then second of all, it's this narrator writing a fiction fact thing. It's like he said, it's kind of a mix of the two, and that just really didn't bode well for me. But from the second chapter, it's changed a lot. So, and there's been some really great writing in it, so I can kind of excuse it, I guess. We'll have to see how that goes. Again, I have one exception to this rule, and again it is by one of my favorite writers, who also happens to be Japanese. Akutagawa Ryunosuke has a short story called Green Onions. We have this narrator who says he needs to write a story. He has a deadline to hand it into the publisher so that he'll get paid the next morning. So he's going to stay up all night. He's going to do an all-nighter to write this short story so that he can hand it in first thing in the morning and get his paycheck. So he's kind of desperate and sleepy, but he's going to write the thing. And then he says, okay, we need a protagonist. We'll come up with this girl. Let's say that she has a sister who's like this. And it's really good because you've got, on the one hand, you get pulled into the story, the fiction, and on the other hand, you've got this kind of background sense of urgency. Even though the story itself isn't urgent, you kind of know in the background you've got this frantic writer who needs to finish it up, and you're kind of interested in how he's going to pull it off. And it just, and also like the themes cross over, right? Like they work together really well, I thought, and it's just incredibly rare, because I do not like narrators who are writing fictions in every single case except for this one short story that I've read. Number 6, I think. 6, inconsistent use of contractions. This is, again, Song of Achilles. I'm sorry, this is not a hate video from Madeline Miller. Like I said, I really liked the book. I thought the pacing was great. But this is something that I do as well in my own writing. When you want to have a character sound sort of old-timey or formal, and you don't put in the contractions. So I do not agree instead of I don't agree. I had not foreseen this. I hadn't seen this coming. You know, it's like, it makes sense in those cases, but then when you do either on purpose, because you also want some casual feelings in there, you don't want to be too stuffy and dry and removed from the reader, or you just kind of forget, which I honestly think is what happened in the Song of Achilles, but you just forget that that's what you're going with for that character, and you throw in some contractions and it's just not consistent, then yeah, it often comes across as really like fake sounding. But yeah, be consistent with your contractions, writers. Okay, I think this is maybe my most controversial one now. Basically metaphors. I mean, not just metaphors, over-reliance on metaphors, but I just don't like metaphors in general, I think. And there's such a huge part of literature. So obviously I don't, like say I don't want to read any metaphors at all in the books I read, and again, this is in my own writing. I feel like I'm over-reliant on them, and by metaphors I kind of mean it in a blanket term, like similes and all that stuff as well. But yeah, I read recently The Lightkeepers by Abby Jenny, not exactly sure about that one, but yeah, she's got so much simile and metaphor just completely swamping the page to describe nature, and sometimes it's kind of pretty, and most of the time I just thought, I forget where I heard this, but I remember hearing somewhere, reading somewhere, that Basho Matsuo's a haiku poet, said that any poem that uses metaphors is never going to be a truly great poem. It can be a really good poem, but it's never going to be a great poem. And he was working in a very specific Japanese tradition of like waka haiku stuff. It had to be all about nature and describing the physical world and the present, and so like yeah. But I kind of feel like I agreed. And in the Western canon, you know, our literature kind of like has a basis in a poem, which is full of metaphors and similes. The Iliad by Homer, that's so full, like its own similes even have their own name, like Homeric similes, and I love those similes, and it's because in some cases I think you can make the similes your own. You know, in Homer, his similes are so specific. They're like super long. They're like usually contrasting a short, horrible, violent thing like a death on a battlefield with a pastoral scene that everybody would relate to. And he brings those together in such an intricate and clever way that he gets his own name. They're called Homeric similes, whereas most people don't like put that much thought into their similes and their metaphors, right? They just use them, I think, because they want to describe stuff. Like in the Abby Jenny book, she described the sun at one point as a fiery ball. Like you can write 10 good similes and then you'll still lose all of my respect when the next one is the sun is a fiery ball. Maybe it's specifically nature. Like when people talk about nature, I don't want metaphors, but it's really hard to write without metaphors. So yeah, I find I over-rely on metaphors all the time. Also, I remember in Flights by Olga Tokarczuk, there was like some crazy similes that were massive and really wild and wacky, and I liked those because they were like kind of, they felt new, they felt fresh. Sometimes a little overwrought maybe, but they were kind of exciting and not something I felt I'd read before. I felt like these are Olga Tokarczuk similes. They were put together with craft, you know, they weren't just there because she didn't have any other way to describe stuff without sounding dull, you know what I mean? So yeah, no over-reliance on metaphors, please. And finally, cliffhangers. Now, I have a lot of time for cliffhangers. Even the really like kind of pointless, ridiculous, cheesy ones where you finish, like in Goosebumps, for those who read the Goosebumps series, I loved those as a kid, and like very often a chapter will end and it'll be something like, suddenly I felt a hand on my shoulder, and then, you know, you have to go to the next chapter, and you know, you can get up, get a drink or do whatever, and you can wait till the next day. You go to the next chapter and the person's hand is like, I turned around. Jeez, man, don't scare me like that. It's like there's no point. It does nothing for the story. It just gives you a little, you know, a little page turn basically. But I was fine with that. I loved them. And like I watched a lot of Doctor Who, like the old classic Doctor Who episodes, and some of those were like that. You finish an episode on someone about to die or hanging off a cliff, and then the next episode they get pulled up again and we just move on with the story. It can be frustrating, but in general I'm fine with it. I feel like in a book especially, you can control when you get back up off the cliff. Do you know what I mean? Like you get to the cliffhanger at the end of the chapter, you're like, this is going to be fun. Next time I pick up the book, I'll see how they got out of that one. What I don't like is the cliffhanger where, again, Lord of the Rings, this was like, I remember when I was young, this was like the one thing I really didn't like about Lord of the Rings, is that the separate books, the parts called books, in the Lord of the Rings, some of them end on cliffhangers, and then the next book goes to a different group of people. So for example, we have Frodo and Sam, and then they end on a huge cliffhanger, that book ends, and then the next one is Gandalf and Pippin, but like back in time. And we read that and it goes on, and I'm just desperate to find out what happened to Frodo and Sam. But we have like months to go or something until we get up to that point again. So eventually that frustration just kind of grows and then dies down, and then I get invested, like, oh, Gandalf and Pippin, they're actually interesting, and I start paying attention now, and I start like wondering what's going to happen to their story, and then what do you know, cliffhanger, and suddenly we're back at Frodo and Sam, who I don't care about anymore, and like, oh yeah, they got out of that, cool. Maybe I'd find it different if I read it now. I love the Lord of the Rings. That was like the only thing that really annoyed me about it, I think, when I was reading it quite young. So maybe I'd be fine with it now. But in general, I've seen this kind of thing before in literature, and I don't like it because, for me personally, it means I can't invest in the thing that comes directly after the cliffhanger if it has nothing to do with it, because I'm still focused on that cliffhanger. And by the time I do care about that thing, it puts me on another cliffhanger and puts me back to the first thing, which I no longer care about. Like, I don't care about that cliff, we're onto a new cliff now. Maybe it's just the way my brain works. I need the resolution, like, not necessarily immediately, but, you know, soonish. So that was my list. That was, I don't remember how many it was, but that was a bunch of things that I do not like, generally speaking, in writing, that I've been noticing a lot lately in the books I've been reading. And yeah, I hope it was kind of interesting or entertaining. I'm not sure if I will continue it, or if I will, you know, I already talked about some positive things in this. Maybe I'll do a list of writing techniques that I absolutely love in books, although, like I said at the beginning, those are harder to come up with for me, but it could be a challenge, it could be nice. So will I do that? Will I not do that? Find out next time on Apocalypse Reading with Seb. That was a cliffhanger, by the way, in case you didn't get it. All foolery aside, though, thank you so much for watching. I really enjoyed making this list. I'd be really curious to hear if other people agreed, disagreed, had their own writing techniques which really, you know, are annoying, or like for me, you didn't notice it until a certain book like used it to death, and then now you can't read it again in any other book without feeling annoyed. Anything like that, I'd love to talk to you about, so put it down in the comments. And yeah, that's all. See you next time. Au revoir.